Our next speaker is Dr. David Gioe, Assistant Professor in the Department of History and History Fellow for the Army Cyber Institute. Dr. Gioe served over 10 years in the intelligence community to include several overseas tours as a case officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. He earned his PhD in Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge, a master's degree from the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and is a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College Command and Staff Program. Please help me welcome Dr. David Gioe.
Thank you, sir. Well, my slides are going up. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. A Philly native, Flyers fan, historian, non-coder. So just to manage expectations. I wasn't sure that I wanted to go last. And I told Dave Raymond, I said, really, why do I have to go last? And he said, he had this great opportunity to say, Dave, we're saving the best for last. Or maybe he could have said, you know, you're our go-to closer. Instead, he said, well, it builds character. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes building myself some character while I talk a little bit about treachery in historical perspective. And today I'd like to compare Edward Snowden and the Cambridge Five. I'm the history fellow. That's different than the historian. I don't chronicle what the ACI is doing. I use history as part of a multidisciplinary team to inform to inform our debate and our dialogue and our product about cyber. So why history? Well, maybe having a historian here is like having bringing a typewriter to a PowerPoint contest, which clearly I'm not going to win. But I hope to show how it is relevant. All the standard disclaimers apply. This is just Dave Gioe's view. This is not the larger government or Army's view. And also, just in test runs here with this program, just a quick reminder that comparison is not moral equivalency. Right? This is the so-called Hitler-Stalin fallacy. When you compare two things, one of them, the lesser of two evils, isn't good. Just to remind folks. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Edward Snowden, or as my friends at NSA call him, he who shall not be named, or Lord Voldemort. Yes, I'm very much on, personal Dave Gioe was very much on that bandwagon. I think, ISIS could experiment on him. That would be fine with me. But I want to do something more than that. I want to have a structured framework for analysis. Snowden is not, it was Bradley Manning. Before them, there were Mitchell and Martin. There's plenty of people who maybe you've never heard of who have done this. He's not the first. He's not going to be the last, I'm sorry to say, no matter how tempested our programs are. And so what I want us to do is to be able to contextualize, to understand, and to be able to quantify some damage. And so that's been my project while I've been with the ACI. I think everybody here knows what he did. If you don't, Rick Howard has a couple of books that he can he can recommend to you. I suggest with the Google machine, that might work as well. So I don't want to spend any time on what he did. I'm going to take that as a given. This is Mike Morell. He's a former deputy director of the CIA, very widely respected professional intelligence officer. And what Snowden did leads to a claim. And the claim is, in Mike's words, and by the way, all of my stuff gets pre-publication review by CIA, so as a way to get around that, I take other people's words that I may or may not want to make my own, so I use a lot of quotes. He said, I think the Snowden leak is the most serious leak, the most serious compromise of classified information in the history of the U.S. intelligence community. And as soon as we use words like ever or in the history, we invite historical comparisons. And so this is a bold claim. I mean, when you say something in the history of, this is a categorical claim. And I mean, just a quick, once over the world hand wave of some other friends of America. You've got on the left side Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, devastating in the human world. And then for you SIGINT bubbas, Ronald Pelton and John Walker, again devastating in the SIGINT world. So in the history of, I think is a pretty bold claim. Because of the special Anglo-American intelligence relationship, Snowden was able to touch GCHQ as well to the tune of maybe 58,000 documents. Pretty substantial. My friend Sir David Omand said that the Snowden leaks are the most catastrophic loss to British intelligence ever. Much worse than Guy Burgess and Donald McLain, two of the stand-in for the Cambridge Five. And I said, David, are you sure you mean that? He was quoted in the Telegraph in the UK, sort of a center-right newspaper. And he said, yeah, not only do I mean that, you can lump in all of the Cambridge Five and George Blake, if you know who George Blake is, another baddie. So he's really stood behind this, and he may not be wrong, but I want us to be able to show our work, right? If 3 into 3 is 9, the 3 times 3 is 9, I want to be able to say, okay, how did we do that? I haven't taken math since 1994, so I'm left out of a lot of the conversations in the ACI, but I try my best. All right, well, here's something that Eddie and I can agree on. We should be suspicious about the sorts of overblown claims by officials about national security. This is the Snowden bot at his TED Talk. Well, that's right. Any bold claim needs to be investigated. And so, fine, we're going to do that. This is a framework that I've tried to put together. It's in no particular order. I tend to think that lives go up at the top, maybe not. But when we look at damage, what are we talking about? Is it money? Is it lives lost? Is it collection compromised? And so here I've just tossed up what I think in sum might be a damage framework. Lives lost, sources, and there I mean human sources, as well as SIGINT collection methods compromised, financial undertaking to replace lost capabilities, financial and reputational damage to U.S. corporations. Chris Cleary will field all your questions on that. Employee morale, mission off task, right? As soon as something terrible happens, we have a giant task force, and we're stealing bodies from what they're supposed to be doing normally. Strategic disadvantage and shifts in balance of power. I'm an intelligence historian by training, and let me tell you, you can actually trace shifts in balance of power, east versus west, no kidding stuff, to intelligence compromise. Loss of foreign policy or national narrative or momentum in those things. Damage to allies and liaison partners. I've written a lot about that. You can Google me and you can see that. And then the loss of future intelligence, both human and SIGINT. I'm a former case officer. After the Snowden thing came out, I'd go up to my GRU buddies at some diplomatic reception, and I'd say, hey, can we have lunch next week? Right? No. Even if the answer before was yes, I guarantee you the answer is no now. So this is Sir Ian Lobban, who said, look, what is this all total to? He says there's a complex and fragile mosaic of strategic capability, and that mosaic is in a far, far weaker place than it was 5 months ago. Admiral Rogers, I think, he represents where we are right now, and he says, look, I'm seeing groups change their behavior, right? So what do we not, what are the unknown unknowns? We don't know. This is recorded futures, basically just saying, hey, look, we can actually now demonstrate what Admiral Rogers is talking about, that the groups are changing their behavior. This is just one case in point. This is Mujahideen Secrets, which was then, this is how baddies talk to each other online. I don't know if it's rudimentary encryption or not, but it was upgraded after the Snowden leaks. And of course, it's not just baddies that use encryption technology. Lots of folks use encryption technology. There are words that I can't say, but Matthew Aid can. There's a huge increase in subscriptions to private phone and text service after Snowden's leaks. Okay. You know the story with Apple. I'm going to move on. And of course, the FBI director says, look, now the pendulum has gone too far in the other direction. General Dempsey said it's going to cost billions of dollars. So if we're looking at damage from a financial lens, here's one answer for that. The New America Foundation put out a report. We're talking somewhere between the tens and the hundreds of billions of dollars. Again, Chris will answer all your questions. And Snowden has said, look, you know what, all this noise, you guys don't know what you're talking about. There's been nothing ever materialized. There's dueling TED Talks, which is pretty interesting, and Cyber Talks are based on TED Talks. So Rick Legend actually then had a rebuttal to Snowden where he came on and gave some numbers to disagree. Well, okay, how do we put this in historical context? We could have, I could use Aldrich Ames. I could use I could use Ronald Pelton. I chose the Cambridge Five because of what David Omand said. So these guys really quickly are Anthony Blunt, Donald McLain, Guy Burgess, Kim Philby, and John Cairncross. Those of you who've seen The Imitation Game might recognize the Cairncross character. In the 1930s, they all attended Cambridge University. 4 out of 5 were at Trinity College, and they were upset at the British class system, and they thought that the communism, and particularly Soviet Russia, represented the best chance for man, for humanity. And so they set about penetrating the British establishment. Now, it's a bit of a matter of perspective, I suppose. After the movie The Magnificent Seven came out, I think in the 1960s, the KGB started calling their Ring of Five spies the Magnificent Five. So you can see again, what's bad to us might be valuable to others. You don't need to know what all of these seals and crests and whatever are on the left. The point I'm trying to make with it is that as a rule, there was nothing in the Anglo-American security and intelligence apparatus between, call it 1940 and 1951 or so, that was not touched, penetrated, turned on its head by the Cambridge Five. They're in everything. Several of these are UK entities, but several, as you'll recognize, are US as well. Again, because of the close working relationship between the Brits and the Americans, voila, and in the same way Snowden got his GCHQ records. In contrast, we see with Snowden was a staff officer with CIA, then became a contractor with NSA, and again, as I said, through the special relationship, there's others. So again, when we're trying to compare these things, access is a big one. Well, what do we want to do? It's those who love us that can hurt us the most, and it's those who we trust who can betray that trust and hurt us the most as well, right? It's the trusted insider that hurts us most of all. I won't explain the top one. It's self-evident. This here is Anthony Blunt as the surveyor of the Queen's pictures. He was actually related to the Queen. On the right, here's Kim Philby next to the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir later Lord John Gort. So again, we're in the establishment now, and that's really where we can do the most harm. I'm just going to quickly go through some highlights of what the five did, just to sort of underscore my point. There's a lot more here that maybe we can get into during question time. But Kim Philby's big, his mama didn't name him Kim, his dad called him Kim. His name was Harold Adrian Russell Philby. And what he did was he was appointed, he got into MI6 because, he was our kind of people, so, very, very clubby sort of individual. And he became head of CI. Later on, he was head of Station Washington, D.C., which is a jumping off point to become C, or head of the service. On his appointment to be head of CI while being a Soviet agent, Ben McIntyre, great novelist, said the fox was not merely guarding the hen house, but building it, running it, assessing its strengths and frailties, and planning its future construction. Robert Cecil, a contemporary, said the history of espionage offers few, if any, comparable master strokes. I just want to tell you quickly two Kim Philby stories, as he's really generally regarded the worst of the five. There was a guy named Konstantin Volkov. He tried to defect to the British in Istanbul in 1945. They didn't have any SIS officers on site. They sent his offer back to London. Well, what was he offering? He said, hey, look, there's a mole in SIS, and oh, by the way, there's 2 more in the Foreign Office. Well, Philby immediately recognized that he was the mole in SIS about to be revealed, and that Guy Burgess and Donald McLain were the 2 in the Foreign Office at the time. What does he do? He tells the Soviets drug Volkov and bring him back to Moscow, where this guy, Yuri Modin, who was the case officer for the five for most of their time as active agents, said the lamb had come to the slaughter. Suffice it to say that he was summarily tried and shot. So what do we now have? We now have blood on the hands of the five. Do we have blood on Snowden's hand? I don't know. Do our lives lost even the most important thing? I presented this at a conference recently, and I had a respondent say, actually, I put foreign policy above lives lost because it's a bigger national picture. I'm not going to argue one way or the other how to weight them, just something to consider when you're ticking off boxes on your score sheets. What else did he do? Well, the Americans and the Brits wanted to roll back communism. And they thought a great place to start to do this was Albania, being separated from Stalin by Yugoslavia, the Tito-Stalin split. So they recruited all these guys, Albanian emigres, to parachute or land amphibiously back into Albania. It's big covert action. They train them in Malta and then try to insert them, take up arms. You think maybe Bay of Pigs, a Cuban operation later on, similar thing. Except that Philby, as I said, he was the head of station in Washington, D.C., at the very nexus of where BG Fiend or Operation Valuable was taking place. He was able to give away the drop zones, the landing times, the names of the agents, where they lived, the weapons they carried. About 300 of them were killed either on landing or then shot afterwards. A lot of blood for Kim Philby. Here he is in this is Kim Philby. He ends up in Moscow. It's a great story we can get into later. But he ends up in Moscow as a consultant for the KGB. Here he is in their memory room looking at his handiwork in Albania. A little pat on the back here from a very young Oleg Kalugin. If you've been to the Spy Museum, Kalugin is an impressive character. He works there now as an American citizen. Okay. True story. Very interesting guy. Anthony Blunt, he was a surveillance master. He worked for MI5, the security service. And what he would do is he revamped completely how the watchers, the MI5 surveillance teams, kept an eye on the Soviet officers and their agents in London, or even in the greater UK. So he said, hey, look, MI5 leadership, adopt my tradecraft. They said, sure, that sounds great. So they did, and then he gave his tradecraft manual to the Soviets, so they now had his textbook. Yuri Modin said they never dreamed that a mole inside their surveillance services had taught us every detail of their methods. And when we're talking about methods, to me, that's the story of Snowden. It's here's what we're doing. He's not a long-term penetration agent. No one, as far as I know, is tasking him, right? He's a defector, whatever. He's a one-time guy. Here's my data dump. These guys were at the heart of it for over 11 years. Yuri Modin said, you know what, so he wrote a great book. It's called My 5 Cambridge Friends. I highly recommend it. And, is this him bragging? Well, maybe. I think it also happens to be true that he basically said, we knew chapter and verse on what MI5 was doing. What a wonderful way to operate in London. I think he's right. What did Guy Burgess do? He again sought to actively undermine the U.S. and the U.K. special relationship with particular regard to not just giving information to the Soviets, but actually actively driving a wedge into the special relationship. I can come back to him later. Here's Donald McLain. The first, Josef Stalin was as well informed about the Manhattan Project as FDR, as Churchill, and much better informed about it than Harry Truman. That's thanks to a guy named Donald McLain. He was also then, in the late 1940s, the linchpin between the U.S. and the U.K. on joint nuclear policy in the very early bits of the Cold War. Stalin knew exactly how far he could go. Talk about a shift in power. John Cairncross, for those of you, played by Alan Leach here. If you're a Downton Abbey fan, he's John Cairncross. John Cairncross penetrated Bletchley Park, which provided Ultra, which was the code name for the decrypts of the Nazi Enigma machine and a couple others. He helped the Soviet Union. Yuri Modin said his reports were instrumental in helping Russia astonish the West by exploding their own bomb. John Cairncross was absolutely devastating. At the Battle of Kursk, for instance, Stalin was getting some of the Ultra stuff, but it was very vague through tear lines. John Cairncross sent him the originals, so that with all of the good metadata, unit identifications, unit names, unit locations, and what Cairncross was able to do was to give all that to Stalin, and at the Battle of Kursk, the Red Air Force destroyed the German Air Force on the ground, thus leading to a faster turn in the tide on the Eastern Front in World War II. Again, terrible things to NATO. So again, let me return to my my damage framework, and I don't want to tick things for you. That's not why I'm here. I don't want to say, see, look, so here's this, here's that. I just want to offer this so when we now talk about the worst ever or the worst in history, we can actually have a common hymn sheet, as the British would say, or a common sheet of music to read off of to show our work. Does it end badly in the case of Snowden? Well, I think it's too early to say for sure. The Cambridge Five, their damage wasn't actually fully understood and known until the mid-1980s, although 3 of them had escaped to Russia and 2 of them confessed eventually. So we need much more time. This, by the way, I think is a bit of a Rorschach for how you feel about the whole Snowden thing. I put this up here because I thought America was vulnerable after what Snowden did, that we were now vulnerable, this is bad stuff. A friend of mine at NSA said, actually, I thought that was NSA, and that the media and people in our own government were ready to pounce. Other people said, no, I thought you meant that was American civil liberties and how now they're threatened by these government programs. And so now I just like to say, what do you see here? And people can but by what you see here, I think kind of illustrates where you are on the whole thing. But the reason why it takes so long is because the challenge for an intelligence historian in particular is getting the primary source documents. Interviews are okay, news articles, well, you know how reliable those are. Leaks are very selective. And so really, from an academic point of view, we don't know, and we're not going to know for a very long period of time, I think. Finally, if the corollary to damage is value, well, who does benefit? For the Cambridge Five, this guy benefited so amazingly. There's so many things that I could go into, but Stalin was a great beneficiary. His KGB actually thought maybe they were plants, maybe they were too good, maybe the British were running it. It was so good. And now, of course, we've got my buddy Vlad, who is able to your guess is as good as mine, or former Congressman Mike Rogers, on exactly what's been provided, but I would wager that he's a real beneficiary in this case. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. Don't feel bad. Usually my cadets are asleep after one of my talks as well.
Dr. Gioe, I got a question for you. What are some of the parallels we can get from this, from some of the people in the audience and industry who's sitting on our left and right, on your willingness to share and collaborate with the people in this room?
I'm not sure I follow.
Is the exchange of information, it's a lot less from where we're standing, or at least from where I'm standing, where I'm working with industry and government. And we are we're breaking new ground every time based on post-Snowden. Everything is given post-Snowden. Where do you see that going?
So this is just my opinion, not necessarily historically based, but just from what I've read, I think it's hugely problematic. One of my tours with the agency was domestic, and as part of the CIA's outreach to corporate partners, things used to be a little bit easier, and it didn't. You didn't get all nervous, about a big ask meeting. Generally, folks were saying, "Yeah, how can we help? What can we do?" And nowadays, I think there's a reluctance, not because they don't want to help, but because things are painted improperly, in my opinion, or they're oversimplified, or they're shaded in a certain way in the media, and so I think that puts our corporate partners in a bit of a pickle, and especially when it comes to legal type issues. And I guess I would sort of agree with the FBI director. I think things have gone too far. And if you look even in the intelligence community after 9/11, the pendulum swings in the intelligence community, and after 9/11 it was need to share. And now I think after Snowden, and especially Manning, in terms of, hey, why does an E2 or whatever he was, need to see what was coming out of U.S. Embassy Seoul in relation to something that didn't have anything to do. So now you can see the pendulum swinging back the other way a little bit. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I'm interested in military ethics and ethics of intelligence, and I've spent quite a bit of time in indirectly. But my specific question is this, and I haven't looked at, what Edward Snowden revealed or something. I just haven't had time. But in a kind of a broad way, what I have heard, what I have read, do you think that the other side, the adversaries, were not already contemplating the very things that Snowden revealed? I mean, I don't think you have to be a genius to figure out at least 30% of it. But so in the kind of long, in terms of effects, how monumental do you think it is? I mean, I know General Hayden thinks it's the worst, and I know you've given some illustrations, but do you really think yourself that it had such monumental impact?
Thank you for that great question. A slide that Aaron made me take out, I can get to put back in because it's a little self-serving. But yeah, so I think the future ripple effects are huge. I wrote about it last year with Tinker, Tailor, Leaker, Spy, and I think even if is there cooperation between the U.S. intelligence community and the corporate sector? Okay, yes, in theory, sure. In theory, did the Anglo-Americans combined force want to invade Fortress Europe on June 6, 1944, or generally before June 6, 1944? Sure, absolutely. Where? How? With whom? What are the details? When is it coming? What's the effect of weather? And all of the things that go into the details, I think, are where the real problems are. In terms of future SIGINT, you already see, and this is in the press, other countries trying to distance themselves from America on the SIGINT side, right? So if you take the Germans, for instance, and this has really been a major bone of contention in Germany, what you see is that they're trying to abrogate some SIGINT relationships. Again, this is all just what I'm reading in the press. And what, if you take as your sort of assumption that bad things can happen based in Germany, for instance, Mohammed Atta and the Hamburg cell planning 9/11 in Germany, it's hard to see how less cooperation could be more beneficial in the long run. And again, from a human perspective, I mean, the Brits are furious. Absolutely, positively furious. The first thing that one of the GCHQ directors said was, "Thank God it wasn't a Brit." And they have every right to be upset with us. How could this happen? 58,000 of our records? You've got to be kidding me. And so ultimately, the relationship is close enough that it will repair. But I'm not going to say that, just because we're going to get over it, there wasn't some damage done. And then finally, as I mentioned, in human land, instead of having a normal agent meeting with your agents where you say, okay, what do you have for me, today? And them giving you information. Now it's, when is my name coming out there? What is my exfil plan? What are you going to do for me? How do I get the hell out of here? And no amount of, well, you see, that wasn't, you're not on JWICS. And what Snowden got was JWICS. And so really, when we talk about HCS on SIPR, they don't want to hear any of that. They just want to hear, when is my name coming out and what can we do? And so you go back to your office and imagine, every case officer across the world having meetings that are totally unproductive because instead of getting TDs or IIRs or whatever it is that you're trying to get, you are now back to square one, re-recruiting every single agent in the arsenal, many of whom are like, you know what, I'm out, thanks. So they just drop the microphone and go. And so that's hugely problematic because you're not then getting those intelligence streams. And so if we're unable to connect the dots before 9/11, how more unable are we going to be to connect dots that we don't even have? So for all those reasons, I think the second and the third order effects are hugely problematic.
David, To those who would call Snowden a whistleblower, is there any historical context or framework that could be used? I mean, because part of my personal concern is that others buy into that narrative. So what is there a historical framework, kind of like the one you described here, that would address the issue of why he is not, or I guess potentially, arguably, he would be?
Right. Thank you, Fernando. That's a great question. You know, in the British context, and you know, so in the American context, when folks thought that CIA was getting out of line in the 1970s, they were called the rogue elephant, right? And Frank Church and everybody testifying. Then the skeletons in the closet lead to something called the crown jewels, or the family jewels, and these get declassified. By the way, these are from the 70s, only fully declassified in 2011. So, you know, sometimes these things really do take an awful lot of time to come out. So, you know, in terms of Snowden, I personally don't think that there's a whistleblower, because there are ombudsmen, there's a chain of command. You can go to your congressman, you can go to a Senate or a House committee. There are plenty of things you can do. All of that aside, in the British context, what it has caused is a sort of lesser church committee where the British have an intelligence and security committee that oversees their intelligence and security apparatus, MI5, MI6, and GCHQ. It doesn't have the same kind of teeth that we have here. And so I guess, you know, those who do buy into that narrative would show you that Snowden, what he's done has caused, for the first time in history, MI5, MI6, and GCHQ to actually come before and testify the ISC in an open hearing. And that happened in November 2013, which is an absolutely historic event. So I don't think that there's a lot of, when you look at the history of whistleblowing, take for instance, you know, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, I think that the history is abused to come to the points that we want. For instance, Ellsberg now, there's a great picture of him, and he's got the sign, and he says, "I was Bradley Manning." Well, no, you weren't. You know, do you not remember what it was that you did? The Pentagon Papers related to a specific program that was a problem for him personally, and he tried to actually run it up the chain of command. He felt like it wasn't working, it was embarrassing for the U.S., and only reluctantly did he go to the press, and then he actually did stick around to face the music. And so I think there's been a misuse of history to now start equating things that aren't similar.
All right.
Nothing for you.
Dr. Gioe, thank you for your historical perspective. Although you admit that you are not a coder or a nerd or any of these things, this badge entitles you membership to our crowd anytime.
I never
Thank
thought
you.
a historian was going to get one of these. Thank you.